So where we were, we had, this is not focus line, right? I'll fix it. So where we were before was we had things working with team 1. Yeah, that's okay. It's just. Yeah. Waiting for those. You might have to go like back out and let it get more blurry. Yeah, but even it's bump up your font size a couple times. So Command plus or Control plus. Even this is a little blurry. I think we have it so if you click on the Add One button for Team 1, we should see our scores going up, but not down. Cool. So let's work on the so let's hook up things for the subtract 1 button. So we're going to do that in the main. That's for our paragraph after that last line 25 and before line 26. So after here, we're going to start writing down what we want the subtract button to do. Well, it's going to be a lot like the add button. So first thing I have to make the subtract button. We're going to find subtract 1 button for that. So we're just going to write the code. Someone tell Chris what the code is. What's the tool we're going to use for finding the button? So add 1 button. We should probably call this one subtract 1 button. Yep. Equal to. And show me a document.create. And the query selector takes a string. Let's put a string here. So let's go to our HTML and see if we can figure out what's selected here. So Chris, if you would go to the index. So here is our subtract button. The same class there to identify it on line 26. And someone give us a suggestion on what we should call this class. Yeah, subtract from team 1. Save that. So now we can use that class name. So maybe copy that. So we can paste it in on the other side when we type it. And back in our main.js, here is the button dot button dot. How we check our work to see if we found the right button? Console log. Let's console log subtract 1 button. Hopefully now, in here, if we highlight that very last button that we found, way down, oh, it's so blurry. This very last button here, if we highlight that in the console, yeah, that's the button. We found it. So now, if we want to do something with that button, it's like for that. button is clicked, we use add event listener. So just like this, we're going to use the subtract one button, add event listener. And we're waiting for the end of event. And in our example above, we used the method name, so just a comma here. And then hit escape to get rid of this. This is nice that they add the documentation, but often like obscures the example. So we call this add one team one. What should we call this one? Yeah, let's call it subtract 1 point from team 1. Let's go define that function up top. So somewhere around 12. Let's go define that function. So somebody give us the syntax for defining the function. Yeah. Letter font, so let. And then what comes next? Yeah. 1. Arrow, and then our braces. Yeah. So hopefully by now we're starting to see some parallels here. That subtract 1 point from team 1 is going to work pretty much like add 1 point. So let me just go and copy that code and paste it in here. Then you grab all of that information, so everything inside of there. Instead of adding 1, what do we want to do? Subtract 1. So change the plus there to a minus. Let's see this and see if it works. Keep subtracting some points. Yeah. Maybe that's a thing eventually we want to fix. Right? Negative points probably don't make sense in whatever sport this is. I don't know. I'm going to leave that to an exercise for the readers if you want to play. Cool. Well, we've got adding and subtracting for team 1. Let's go work on the same thing for team 2. So where do we head? We'll head back to the bottom of main. It's probably going to be a lot like this part here. By the way, feel free if you want, we can get rid of these console logs. Once we've confirmed that things are working, we can zap those console logs. If you select it, if you triple click, it'll select the entire line. So double click will select a word, triple click will select a line. Let's go back to me. And let's add getting the button for adding to team 2. So, pretty much this is what finds the button for team 1. Let's grab that. Right, so this should be much the same. Let's paste it. So it's not going to be the class add 1 for team 1, it's going to be the class add 1 for team 2. Let's go add that class to the button. So let's take that class name. Now you probably want to just grab just the class name portion. Back in the JavaScript. You grab the whole, just let's find the code going to be down below. There it is. Let's add the class there. Class equals let's go back to our JavaScript code. We've got a little bit of a problem now. We have a different variable name here. Add one button. So we've got to come up with a unique variable name here. So let's call it like add. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we get so this is where John was saying earlier, we could chain these methods together and would remove the need for variable. Show that a little bit. And then instead of add 1 point for team 1, we'll make this add 1 point for team 2. Now team 2. Like the method for let's go grab the method that we did for team 1. All that. Just like we're going to change the name of the method to team 2. Now here's the challenge. We only have one variable called count. We pop this variable. So let's go to the top where we have count and give a second variable to keep track of how many points there are for team 2. Somebody want to give us a new variable for counting points for team 2? Yeah. Count 2. And that's going to be equal to 0. So generally, we want to try and use the most descriptive variables we can. Yeah. So maybe what we want is to name this count for team 2. And later on, we're going to come back and refactor or improve the code for count. So let's change that variable to call count for team 2. There's a limit though. I think count for team 2 is about as long as we need it and as descriptive as we need it. I think you can read that in English and kind of know what the purpose of that variable is. This is the function that we're looking at. So we're not going to add to count, we're going to add to count for team. Let's change count. So let's save this and see what happens. So let's bring that down a little bit. So let's click on add 1 point. Didn't happen. Okay. So we have an error code here. Reload the page. Yeah, reload the page. Let's see if we have an error. Oh, we're saying count here. This needs to be counted. We have a challenge. Right, it's updating the wrong team. Right? Because we're just finding the very first p tag on the page. This means that this selector has to be more specific. Let's find p tag that we have team 2 score. Let's put a class on both of these. this one? Yeah, let's do score dash team 2. Dash team dash 2. Let's go ahead and put the similar class on that P tag as well. Oops. Let's come back to our JavaScript. Now, so on this one for team 1, it's P dot score for team 1, score dash for team 1. And then the other P tag that we have down below, that's the P tag for team 2. Same thing on our score for team 1. Let's save this and see what happens. That's our add for team 1. Good catch. Let's go back to our HTML and see if our class is one. Oh, it's the score team 1. There's no 4. So add that. So you need to add the word for here or take it away from the JavaScript. They have to match. It's team 4 dash 4 dash 1. So it goes before the other team. Score 4 team 1. That's my bad. Then in my head, that's what I would have called it. I would have added the word 4. So add the word 4 down here as well. These same places. And you can see it's really picky about having everything lining up. Now everything should be okay, I think. Let's see if we can add some points to team 1 and take away points from team 1. Yeah, take away the points. We add points to team 1. Let's go to our JavaScript. Let's go to the end of main.js. And let's do the same thing for points for team 2. So we can grab this here. Same thing for team 1. Let's copy and paste that afterwards. And then we have to do the same thing. We have to give this a unique variable name. Add one button. Change the team 1 to team 2 at the end there of line 51. Change the variable name 152 to be our new variable name. One button for team 2. Now we just need to have a function called subtract 1 point from team 2. They don't match. Once it's 14 and then once it's from team. Okay. Yeah, good point. And then the same thing on 52. Yeah, we should keep our tenses and our words the same. So now find the subtract team 1 function. There's between lines 12 and 19. That's the work that subtracts from team 1. Let's grab that. Copy it. And let's add low at so after line 27. The idea is there should be a rhythm to the code add, subtract, add, subtract. Deal with team 1, deal with team 2. Could we do add, subtract, subtract? Sure, that's fine too, as long as we're consistent. So in our function for team down here, that's in our subtract function. Let's fix this up on line 28. That's subtract from team 2. Count for team 2. Let me show you something cool. Highlight the word count there. Now hit Control D. So you see, as you hit that, you hit Control D, the count. If you want to change, you could then type in a type over all of them. It doesn't quite work here because we use the word count here, here, and here. But you can see, just click on count again. Yeah, click on that word again. So if that was the only thing, you did Control and D. I Control D. Oh, I yeah. Yeah, selecting all of them. But it's so let's just change that to count for team 2. Just the idea that you can have multiple cursors. Count for team 2. And then on line 30, there's a 1 there. We change that 1 to 2. Score for team 1 on line 30. All of it. No, that one is count. Yeah. Do we need the P, or is that practice to put P before? I'm going to talk about all of those things here in a minute. Yeah, there's some things we're going to clean up in here and some options. Or we could have just said dot for team 2. We don't necessarily need that. Let's see if all of the adding and subtracting is working now. So let's add some points for team 2. Points. Team 2. Subtract some points. Oh, we have an error down. What did we get? What does it say? Cannot new property added that listener. No. So what that's saying is it's it's saying that this came back. It says can't call add event listener on null. It's saying this subtract 1 button from team 2. Let's figure out if we can find out why it's not matching. Subtract from team 2 is a button. Let's go back into our HTML, see if we can find subtract from team 2. It found nothing. And you can't add an event listener to nothing. So on line 43, let's add the class that we're supposed to have there. Class. Oops. Subtract from team 2. Let's save that and see what happens. Let's see if we can add some points. See if we can do the initial step, set up 10 to a 0. We go back to the main.js, find where we're in top of our main function. We need a similar set of lines of code for team 2. another variable for team 2's count below line 41. This is going to be score for team 2. We could just say p tag for team 2. We want to find the p tag for team 2, so we're going to use what? Query selector. The document query selector. And then what's the selector we're going to use? For team 2. And now we use on the next line, we're going to do something very similar about 41. We're going to say p tag is equal to what? Count for team 2. Yeah. Count for team 2. And save that. We just double check that our adding and our subtracting work. Give us some points for team 1. Give us some points for team 2. Yeah. Adding and subtracting. And then I will wrap up the part where we deal with the input tags and the part where we deal with some of the cleanup. So do we get add and then get commit? And let's say like good. Yeah, maybe something like all the add and subtract buttons work. Cool. Yeah, so go ahead and go ahead and yes. This was actually their Monday night assignment. Let me see. It didn't push it. So yeah, try to get add again. No, it's your commit that didn't work. Git commit. You have a file here. So go back to directory. Go back to directories. Go back one more directory. And delete the file .git. So del for delete. And then see that git. Oops. That file. .git/hooks/ pre-commit. Yeah, delete that file. Now try your commit again. Now you don't have to CD again. That's fine. You can do the commit from here. So just be careful. Okay. And then push. We gotta check to see why you keep getting that error, because you've gotten that a couple of times. Go ahead and push, and we'll look at it in the afternoon. Cool. Okay. So let's connect you and pull again. Okay. And then I pulled down Chris's code. And let's take another look at it here. Now let's take a look at, oops, I'm not in the right place. Let's get the browser going. And let's get the code going. Cool. So here's Scoreboard. I'm in the wrong directory here. Let me get out of here. Make sure I'm in the right directory. There, I'm in the right directory. Cool. So here's our code so far. Let's make sure that this is working. We're adding, and we're subtracting, and we're adding, and we're subtracting. Cool. So the next thing we want to be able to do is be able to type in these names, right? SDG, awesome players, right? And then change the name of team 2. So in order to do that, by now we should see that we need something to uniquely identify these teams. So let's go in here and find these team names. So here's team 1. Let's add a class for this team 1. Team 1 name. Let's add a class here. Team 2 name. So now that we have a class for each of these, we can target them to change them. But we need now the same thing for these 2 update buttons. So let's find this update button and give it a class. Let's call this update team 1 name. And let's do the same thing for this update button. Update team 2 name. We're going to need the same thing for these inputs because this is where the information for the name is going to come. New, let's call this new team 2 name. And let's call, oh, we already had one here. Oh, I see. Let's call this new team 1 name. New team 1 name. So we've added classes to all the elements that we're going to be working with. We've added classes for these, for this input, and for this button. We have all of the things identified in our interface. We can start working with them in our JavaScript. Let's come over to the JavaScript. And let's at the bottom make this smaller so you can see. Let's say, what do we call this? What do we call our button? We called it update team 1 name. Update team 1 name button is document query selector. The button that has update team 1 name. Let's console log that. So hopefully we found the right button name. Here's our console. And if we scroll this into view, lo and behold, there's the button. So when this button is clicked, update team 1 name button, add event listener for a click. We're going to call update team 1 name. Let's go define that function. Let update team 1 name is a function. And let's write down what this has to do. What's the first thing that this has to do when we start clicking this button? We want to take whatever is in the input field and put it where the team 1 name is. So the very first thing we have to do is find the team 1 name input element, read whatever is in that input, change the team1 name to that value. This is essentially what we have to do. We have to find that input, read what the person typed in, change the team1 name to that value. So what's the, right, if we're finding an element, again, it's document query selector. And then we give it the name of the selector. In this case, it's this here. Yeah. So instead of being a class name here, it's an ID. And we can say this, because that's the selector for ID. I could. This would also be acceptable.
If you have a class on just one element, I guess you don't ever really have to specify the element.
Yeah, and we're gonna go through at one point and clean this up and talk about the difference between those two. So to keep things kind of along the way, this is what we've done. So now, let's see if we found the right thing. So if we click on this button, yep, that's the input we were looking for, isn't it? Right, you see I'm highlighting this and the input I'm expecting. Now, let's get rid of this. We need to read whatever's in the input. Let's call this new name. Now we're going to read something from this input. We're not going to be changing what's in it. We're going to be reading what's in it. And if we were to look up the documentation for an input tag, we would see that it has a value. The value of an input is whatever the person has typed in. Let's see if we got that right. If we log this new name, now we type something in here. When we press update, we should see the word something log. So this finds the input. This reads what's inside of that input and then logs it. If we change this to say something else, and update, we get something else. Toby?
Value doesn't need to be used on just an input selector, right? It can be used on any variable that we're trying to find the value of.
So this is the value of the input field.
And that is always the way it's used.
This is how we use it for anything that's an input field.
Okay.
So if you looked up the documentation for an input field, let's go look up the documentation for an input field. So if we go to MDN input element, we would see one of the attributes of an input element would be its value. So here are all the things that we can have as types of, and here are all the attributes that it has, and eventually here, after a while, we would get the value, the initial value of the control. Actually, if we go even further, right, so we get the value of the control. We have an example. So it's the input field. So so checkboxes, radio buttons, inputs, drop-downs are all different kinds of controls. So this will tell us that value is what lets us read what's inside of this. If this were a drop-down, the value would be which thing did they pull out of the drop-down. So the value is not reading from a variable, it's reading from this DOM element. Remember that when we get back a query selector, what comes back is a representation, a variable that represents this thing in the user interface. So remember when we changed the text content of a p tag? That's because that's how a p tag gets rendered. It's whatever the text is inside. This input doesn't have any text content. What it has is a value. what did the user type into this? What I type. Right? The value of an input field is whatever's typed inside of it. Now, in order to change the team name, we need to find that element, change its text content. So how do we find an element? Query selector. What's the selector for where the name is? It's up here. Team1 name. So this is the selector we're looking for. What is it? It's an H2. Team1 name. Team1 name. We're changing its text content. And it's going to be equal to what? New name. So let's scroll this down a little bit. FBG coders. Right. We're changing the team name. Right. Down here, we get the button, and we add a listener that says update the team1 name. That's the name of the function. What does update team1 name need to do? It needs to find the input element here. So we use query selector to find that. We read the value out of it. That's what's currently in the input. We don't need this console log anymore. And then we go find the team1 name element, and we set its text content equal to whatever's inside that variable. Find the element, read its value out, find the element we want to replace, change its text content. I will leave team2 to you all to do if you want to do it independently. If you want to work on this on your own, I'll leave the implementation of team2 name change to you. Let's talk about a couple of things in here. So one question John asked is, do we have to keep saying all of these p tags and buttons? The answer is no. These classes are enough to identify all of these elements without the name of the tag. So I'm going to add this. Adds updating of team1 name. So let's re-change the code, refactor the code, and let's take out the places where we had the tag and leave just the classes. So we don't actually have to have the tag names here because the class name alone is enough to identify. So in all these places where we said button dot and p dot, just the class name dot whatever is enough for us to work with finding those. So again, same thing here. We don't need the input to identify the ID. We don't need the H2. And all of this should still work. Okay? Because that class name is enough to find it. So we don't actually need that. You only want to specify enough to be unique without any additional. The reason why is if we were to change this p tag to an H3, where we still had p dot score for team1, we'd have to go into our JavaScript and change all those selectors from p to H3. So this is enough to identify it. We don't need the additional part of the p tag.
Are there ever times that you would apply the same class to different time zones?
Absolutely. If they had the same meaning, then you would apply the same. And then in that case, if you wanted to identify one versus the other, you would have to have the tag name. So the other question that was asked was, let's give this example up here at the top. So we made a variable called ptagCount just so we could come in and say, change the text content. You'll notice that we never use p tag count there again. Right? In this main function, we create p tag count, but we never use it again. And if that's true, then we don't actually need this variable. So this is a little bit of an advanced technique. If we're going to create a variable one time and just use it in one place, we can remove the variable and use whatever this is returning and tack the text content onto the end like this. And this would work the same. The same thing is going to be true here. P tag for team2 is only ever used here. We could get rid of this variable and then tack the text content equal count for team2 on the end here.
So it's saying find this class or ID and change the text.
All in one step. Right? The same thing could be done here, because the add one button, we're only using it to add an event listener. So we could get rid of this. Okay. And then we can add event listener, click, add 1 point for team1. We could do this together. And notice how prettier it's automatically formatted my code, so it's not running long, right? Yep, we just got rid of the need for that variable. So the same thing is true here. We don't need this subtract one button variable. We can tack onto the end of this, add event listener, click, subtract 1 point, subtract 1 point for team. From, we got rid of that variable. So the same thing is true here. We can get rid of this variable, query selector, and then add event listener, click, add 1 point for team2. And we can get rid of this. Let's save. And we can keep going down this list. I'm gonna speed up here a little bit. So we can get rid of this. We can get rid of this variable. And we can just tack this onto the end here. And the same thing here. We can get rid of this variable. And we can get rid of this variable. And then just so this is a little bit tighter. But the reason why I have those variables is I like to be able to have the console log check. So I will write it out the very long way, and I will come back later and tighten it up. Right? I don't mind if your code is 5 times as long as it's working. Long correct code is better than brief incorrect code. So I would actually do it this way if I were programming. I would write it up a long way, and then there's always time later for coming back and refactoring. That's what this task is called. Coming back to the code and improving it, right? We've improved it in some ways. It's tighter, but we've also made it a little bit more dangerous because remember when we had one of these query selectors wrong, remember we got that null? So if this doesn't mismatch, there's no chance to do our console log and see where our mistake is because we're immediately calling add event listener on what comes back. So this is a little bit briefer, but a little bit harder to work with. That's why I always start kind of the long way. So that was one thing that we came across. The same thing is going to be in here. Here's our, actually let's start up here. Right, we do a document query selector for the p tag count. We set the text content equal to count. Right, we don't need that extra variable. Same thing here. We don't need this variable. We can set the text content equal to count. Same thing here. We can make the text content equal to count 14.2. Same thing here. We can delete all of this and say the text content for this is equal to count 14.2. We can get rid of this.
Sorry, what did you say the difference was when you put a variable after equals sign, as opposed to, so you have count 14.2 equals count 14.2 plus 1, and then the next time you have all that stuff equals count 14.2.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was yesterday, Shay and I we had a question, and you said it'll read from right to left.
So we're always, JavaScript always does the right-hand portion first, figures out the answer, and then assigns it to the left. All languages work that way. So if we're going to replace what's inside of count 14.2, it first adds 1 to it, and then assigns it to count 14.2. What's happening here is first, we look up what's inside of count 14.2. Right? We look what's inside of here. Highlight all this. Right? We figure out what's inside of this first. Then we assign it to what's on the left. What's on the left is, first we have to document query selector to find this element, and then set its text content. This is why normally I break things into individual variables, because if I started with this, I'd be blowing your minds harder than I'm already blowing them, right? Because this is like doing multiple things in one step, right? So at the point when I said, hey, we're done, and I started to refactor, like if you're cool up to that point, we're cool. That's as far as I ever expect you to take this code. What I'm showing you now is like deeper down the rabbit hole, right? If you were to go to a team and you will see a more senior developer, this is the kind of thing that they would be doing, right? Making the code tighter, more organized, right? So don't worry if getting the code to this part you don't do, or even like my brain doesn't handle, because this is we're kind of beyond the, like this is like adventure mode kind of stuff, right? This is like adventure and epic mode kind of stuff, right? At the point where I committed and said, hey, this is where the buttons are working, if you're cool to that point, that's as far as I expect you to be able to follow along. That's as much as you need, for instance, to do tonight's homework. This part is bonus stuff. The other thing we can talk about is all of these classes that we added, right? We added classes to all these individual elements, and notice how we had to do team 1, team 1, team 1, team 2, team 2, team 2, and our selectors are such. One thing we can do is up here, we can add a class here. Let's call this team 1. Well, if this is team 1, we can just call this name, and we can call this score. We should really make these double quotes. So if this is team 1, and this is name, and this is score, in our JavaScript, this is no longer score for team 1. We need to change this selector. What's the selector now? Well, it's the name class inside of team 1 and the score class inside of team 1. So this becomes team 1 score. A score class thing that's found inside of team 1.
There's a space between one and
Yes.
So it looks different than, oh no, it's not, okay. So that's similar to CSS.
It's exactly the same rules. If I wanted to color that one, so if I wanted to come in here and say, go find the class team 1 and change its background color to green, right, is that entire section. Right, that's all of team 1, that's this entire section. But then if I say, only look inside of team1, and only the class that's named inside of the thing that has the class team1, only make that green. That's just that. So the same selector rules that we can use in CSS for nesting things, we can use inside of our JavaScript. Right? So there's the score, and then somewhere around here we have the name. Right? So inside of here, this query selector is now go find team1 and find the name inside. So now we do this SVG coders. Okay. So what this lets us do is have simpler class names. I don't have to keep repeating team1, 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 because .team1.name will find this. The same thing will happen down here. If I put class is team2 and change this to name and change this to score, I'm hitting delete. I'm hitting the delete key. Yeah, I use a very different editor than you all do. So I will do keyboard shortcuts that are not available to you, because I'm using an editor. I'm using a mode called Vim mode, because that's the editor that I know best. So I'm doing some keystrokes and editing that are unavailable to you. So if we change this also to team2 name and score, right, the same thing is going to be true. I'm going to make this font smaller so it stops jumping around. Right? So now I don't have to have this score for team2. I can say team2 score. Now this works. What you'll find is rather than keep repeating team2 name, add for team2, subtract from team2, once you give the parent a class, your class names here can just become add and subtract. And this can become add and subtract. So our button selectors down here become team1 add. Oh, and this one changes to team1 subtract. I need the document. And this.
Sorry, does it matter? You have to put the team1 first.
Yeah, because it's nesting. It comes in the same order of the nesting.
In the line.
Yes. Yeah. This is team2 subtract. Because it's the same rules as CSS. Right? So in CSS, dot first class, dot second class, this looks for an element who has the class second class that is nested inside of another thing that has the class first class. Right? So when we say like, hey, learning how to do CSS selectors is pretty important. It's because it's the same thing we use in styling, is the same thing we're going to use to start identifying things in JavaScript. They're linked together in concept.
If I was looking for a key tag inside of the
Div P. This is every p tag inside of any div.
So if there was a class inside of that div,
Yep. This is anything, any kind of tag at all, with the class name here, inside of any div. Right? The space is the descendant selector rule. So if we wanted to do this, this is any li that's inside of a ul, that's inside of any element that has the class name here, which is inside of a div. That's a pretty specific rule, right? It's this hierarchy, right?
if there was a comma,
If it was a comma here, this is anything that's an li inside of a ul, or any element that has the class name here as my class that's inside of a div. Either of those will have this rule. Rather than repeat the rule once here and again here, right? You could do this, right? Right, and the rule here, right? Color red and color red, but that's wasteful, right? If you mean I want the same thing, then you can UL, LI like this, and just combine them together, right? So practicing these selectors really helps. But this is the kind of thing that you'll get good at it for a while. If you start out like we did, where you're just putting classes on everything and repeating the names, awesome. That's awesome. Whatever helps you make it work. What I'm showing you is the next phase of getting things a little bit tighter is making things work like this. Right? You can already see that the wordiness of our HTML is reduced. But in the beginning, I don't mind and I don't care, and that's how I start with the details. Because it's easier to just say, I'm going to give this thing a nice long name, and I'm going to query selector for it, and I'm done. Eventually, when we start building a practice, we will get to the point where we can give a parent a class and a child a class, and then use the child selector to identify them.
Is there any more risk to doing it this way? Because for me, like, the way you're doing, at least the HTML, is way more readable for me. I feel like
this way?
Thinking about it this way is easier for me to, I mean,
yep.
You don't think that's more risky?
Nope. I think if you can start out thinking this way, you should do it. If you want to start out thinking the other way, where you just every time you need to identify something, you put a nice long class name on it, and you go find it in document query selector, awesome. That works too. It's really whatever helps you understand the key portion, which is I need to put elements on the page, and I need to be able to identify them. And you can either identify them if they're a unique tag, or you can throw a unique class on it, or you can identify the parent lineage that identifies that one selector. As long as whatever approach you take, you know that you've identified the right element, so you can text content it, or you can add event listener to it. Whatever path you want to take to get there is perfectly fine. I'm just showing some alternative ways here. Whatever path you take. The challenge with this is you've got to be pretty good at query selectors or CSS selectors to make this work. So if you feel confident in your CSS selector work, totally do it this way. If not, then hey, I'm just going to add a class, new team2 name here, and go directly for that element. I'm not going to worry about parent and child selectors. Yeah?
Is there a point in the refactoring process that you're going to like make people's eyes bleed, or just like way above board with simplification?
Yeah. So I'm just. Do you mean like here for students or for like other developers? In your job. Yeah. So you want things. I can't remember the artist who said it. Like, I know when I'm done with a sculpture, not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing more to take away. So you want things as simple as they can be, but no simpler, right? You want to make things as simple as possible. Yeah, you can keep trying to get this as tight as possible, but at some point you get that idea of diminishing returns. I'm going to put more work in and get less out of it. I think for something like this is about that level. I have a section that says this is team 2, and I have a button that says add, right? Well, you can get really fancy. You can get really fancy and take off these classes and use an nth child selector to say, I mean the second button, or I mean the first button. Cool, we've taken off a class, but I've made my JavaScript more difficult. And I've said now the order of the buttons matter. So that's the idea of you want it so simple that as you change things, it won't matter. But if you make it even more simple, right, taking away the amount of text that's in the app, it's not about that. It's about the making the concept simpler. So yes, you can over refactor to something that's now too difficult to use.
Would you say it's more important though to make sure that it's readable? Like not so simple that someone after you can't figure it out.
Yeah, remember I said that like think about the code you're writing as if the person who's going to come behind you is some like homicidal killer that knows where you live, right? Right. You want it so simple so that other people find it easy. Think about yourself a year from now. If you put this code down today and came back a year from now, what's the variable name that's going to help you remember what the heck this thing is? Right? What's the class name I can put on this that will help me remember a year from now why this class name is here? That's the rule that I use to figure out what to name things. Right? Like I said, I don't mind longer names because if they help you remember what the thing does or what it is, I'm good. That's why I said I think count for team 2 here is a slightly better variable name than count 2. If I call this count 2 and I walk away from this code for a year and I come back, how long is it going to take my brain to realize, what is count 2? Why are there 2 counts here? Is it for the second team? Maybe? But count for team 2 tells me in my face what it is. Cool. So this last portion here is a lot of hand-wavy stuff I'm showing just to kind of show you like the more advanced things we can do. Like, I know there's a lot of glassy eyes from just the part we did before this. Don't worry at all about the last part. Let's talk about your homework. Here's your homework. Where is it? Rochambeau is rock, paper, scissors, for those who don't know what Rochambeau is, right? If you played rock, paper, scissors before, one player chooses rock, paper, or scissors, and there's rules. Has anybody never played rock, paper, scissors? If you've had a couple classes where people have never played rock, paper, scissors before, that's totally fine. So you're going to write a program that allows 2 people to play rock, paper, scissors against each other. Here is what a rock, paper, scissors might look like. This is from a student in Cohort 11. I expect user interface, create your own, right? Style it however you like. Keep it reasonable. Keep it fun, but not like overly crazy. Remember, this is probably going to be part of your portfolio at some point. So here's 2 players. On this one, I would probably suggest not the bright red because it's a little bit hard to read. So there's 2 players. Player 1 has some buttons that I can click on for rock, paper, and scissor. Player 2 has some buttons that I can click on for rock, paper, and scissor. So who wants to be player 1? Somebody raise their hand. Cool. What do you want to play?
Rock.
Rock. Player 2, who wants to be player 2? Somebody raise their hand. Cool. John, what do you want to play?
Scissors.
Paper. Player 2 wins. Right? And there's a button that lets us play again. So what I'm expecting from your program is to have some number of things to click on for player 1, so they can choose rock, paper, or scissor. I would like to see something else on the screen for player 2 for rock, paper, or scissor. Once both players have picked their throw, something on the screen should change to say who won. Right? As a user, I should be able to see 3 buttons for each player. I should be able to pick an option for either player. When each player has made their selection, I should see who won, and the game is over. Right? Adventure mode would be things like having the choices disappear. This is a decision this programmer chose. So like once I make my choice, all the buttons disappear and some other text appears. That's like a little adventure mode challenge. You don't have to do this part. Right? We don't have to have a button with an animated GIF behind it that lets you play again. As long as you get to the point where I can click on rock and somebody else can click on paper, and it tells me who wins, that is explorer mode for this homework. Right? These kinds of things, hiding the buttons and having a fun play again button, that's your adventure mode kind of thing. If you want to go even further, maybe you can make a version that only has 1 player and the other one plays against the computer, right? Where the computer follows some kind of strategy. Maybe it cheats. Maybe it picks randomly, right? Have fun by adding colors and animation and effects to make it more enjoyable, right? The computer game is currently 1-on-1 for epic mode, right? Add more computer or users to the game, right? So maybe there's 3 players, right? Or two human players and a computer, right? The basic though, and I suggest even if you're going to try for adventure on this, Start out by having rock, paper, and scissors for player 1, rock, papers, and scissors for player 2. Follow the same guide we did for Scoreboard. Get all the elements on the page first. So player 1 and buttons, player 2 and buttons. Then style them a little bit. Then start adding the ability to click on the different buttons and do what you need to do. The best thing I can recommend is try and work out that English description of what happens. What happens when you click on rock on player 1? What does the computer need to do once that happens? Right? We'll try and write that down. What happens when someone picks a player 2? What happens? And then how does the computer decide which is the winner? Right? See if you can work out on paper in like description how that works. The more you can write down how that flow happens, right, the easier the logic of this program is going to be. At some point, you're going to have to say, you're going to have to use something like an if statement. Right? If player 1 picks rock and player 2 picks rock, that is a tie. If player 1 picks rock and player 2 picks paper, then player 2 wins. Right? So clearly, you're going to have to somehow remember what player 1 chose and remember what player 2 chose. Know that they both made a choice, and then figure out who won. Right? If I play rock and they play rock, then it's a tie. Question?
You don't always need an else statement for an if statement.
You do not.
So it could be like, if this condition is met, do this, and the implied is else nothing.
Else nothing. Yeah, every if statement does not need an else. But you can have ifs and elses. Yeah? So let's do this in layers. Make your new app, lay out all the, like do your design, right? Draw out on paper what you want this to be. Some people have made the rock, paper, and scissors buttons that have images in them of a rock and a paper and a scissor, right? If that's what you want, like draw that out, what that's going to look like. Put the elements on the page, style them a little bit, put classes on them so you can identify them, start hooking up JavaScript to them so when you click on them, they do things. Then figure out when I click on these various buttons, what do I need to do or remember or keep track of? And then how will I know when it's ready for the computer to decide who won? Then work through how is the computer going to decide if it's a tie or player 1 wins or player 2 wins. See if you can work on that logic on your own for a little bit. Right, come up with your own design, work on the logic on your own a little bit. And I will tell you that Cohort XI did a good job with this of like getting together, right, after class or in the evenings to like challenge each other, work together, provide hints. That might be a thing you all do. Campus is open tomorrow. If you all want to come in and work on it here, you're certainly welcome to. You don't have to. You can work on it solitary, or you can kind of team up and work on it together and help each other. My hint is if you're going to work together, try both as a person who's asking for help and a person who's giving help. Try not to give the answer, but kind of help lead them to where it is. Give hints rather than code. Right? Hints work great. Code if you must. Remember my rule that if you copy code or take code, make sure you understand how it works. Right? If you need a little bit of code to get you over a hump of understanding, borrow that code. All developers do it. Just make sure that you understand the way that thing works, and you could explain, yeah, okay, that's how that if statement works, or this is why we did add event listener here. Yeah. Does this make sense? What this is asking you to do? I'll drop this link in Slack so you have an example. I'm not saying do this exactly, right? Come up with your own view of what this should look like, right? I don't want to see 8 copies of this, right? Because I got 8 different versions of this from Cohort 11. I should probably get 8 different versions of this from Cohort 12. But functionality-wise, rock, paper, player 2 wins. You don't have to make them disappear. You don't have to have a crazy cat laser eye play again button. Even if this didn't disappear and this didn't disappear, as long as this says who won or who tied, that is Explorer mode. Make sense? Yep. So you have all the bits that you need for this. It's a little bit different than Scoreboard because we're tracking different information, right? We're not adding points. Right? It's a little bit different. Just think about the information that you need to gather. Right? Again, it's data and behavior. What information do I need to track? And what's the behavior that happens when different things in the interface happens? If you want to write down your approach and your strategy, right, and come share that with me, I'm happy to give you feedback. Like, hey, Gavin, here's what I think my program needs to do, and I've written it down in English sentences. Does this seem right? I will give you feedback and help guide you. Does that make sense? Yes? No? Cool. This is due on Thursday. So you have tonight and Halloween day to work on it. And we'll turn this in on Thursday. And then, just so you kind of see where we're going. So John, you asked me. On Thursday, what we're going to work on is we're going to skip all cards on deck. And for your weekend homework, we're going to work on blackjack. We're going to make a blackjack game, a 2-player blackjack game. So kind of a step up from Rochambeau. Still a 2-player game. One is going to be the dealer, and one is going to be a human player. And we're going to talk on Thursday about all the things that we need, so we're ready to tackle this. This is going to be Thursday's homework over the weekend. Cool. Tonight is start working on. Don't worry about blackjack. Focus in on Rochambeau. Cool. All right.